Sarah Carpenter began her career in snow and avalanche work in 1998 as a patroller at Bridger Bowl. She is now co-owner of the American Avalanche Institute in Jackson, Wyoming, and she is an AMGA certified ski guide. And we are very happy that she traveled all the way here to share her work with us today.
And I don't know if I could have built the group of speakers better for what I'm going to talk about. So thank you to everyone who's gone before me and hopefully set me up for success. There's been a lot of conversation about risk and uncertainty and navigating how we travel in the backcountry. And I'm here to talk about one of the tools that we as an organization and myself as an individual have been using for the last few years. And that's a checklist. And we're all striving for this, right? Be it on skis or a snowboard or on a snowmobile, we all want great powder skiing. We all want the bliss of traveling in the mountains and having a successful day. And the hurdle for all of us, I think, is navigating terrain and not getting caught in an avalanche like this. And how do we systematically approach each day in the backcountry to stay out of harm's way? And we had a conversation this morning at the professional panel of how do we reduce worker risk? And one of the pieces of that we talked about is in order to reduce risk, and it pertains to all of us, we need to understand it. So I do want to define risk. And it's the likelihood of something happening or the probability of an occurrence times the consequence. What happens if I'm caught in this avalanche? When we're thinking about backcountry travel, you all have a great resource in the Northwest Avalanche Center, right? In order to understand the risk each day, you all are referring to this forecast. And the forecasters are giving you their assessment of the risk. What's the avalanche hazard? Well, I did just screen grab a few different days, so this is not the current forecast. On this day, it's considerable at high and mid elevations, and then moderate at low elevations. And the great thing about your forecast center, it gives you the definition of considerable right on this page. If it weren't there, could folks actually give me the definition of considerable? Yeah, I can't recite it either, right? But one of the things that we did, a friend of mine and I started looking at how can we reframe this conversation for those of us that aren't avalanche forecasters? What are the forecasters actually trying to tell us? What's the avalanche hazard? So I took that definition of risk, likelihood times consequence. What we did with consequence is we took it and turned it into the size of the avalanche. And the bigger the number, the bigger the avalanche, right? And by definition, a D2 or a size 2 avalanche is big enough to bury or kill a person. So I overlaid the likelihood. The top, it's almost certain. At the bottom, it's very unlikely. And then on the other axis, we put the destructive scale, and then put those avalanche hazard ratings. And for me, this visual overlay, while not perfectly accurate, helped me visually to understand what the forecasters are trying to communicate. In low hazard, it doesn't mean there's no hazard. These guys tell us that every day. But the hazard is of small avalanches. And a little bigger avalanche may be very unlikely to trigger, while small avalanches may be likely. At moderate, that likelihood and consequence bump up. And as the hazard increases, those likelihood and consequence formulas bump up. The amazing thing in the last many years that has evolved is our forecasters continue to try and give us more and more information. And so they give us the avalanche problems now, right? Then there's a variety of them, from wind slab to storm slab to deep persistent slab. The goal is to communicate more information to us as backcountry travelers. And sometimes it's hard to understand that information. But for me, again, I took it back to that likelihood times consequence. And then I overlaid the avalanche problem. And for me, a storm and wind slab at considerable hazard may look something like this. Generally, they're a little more predictable, and they are likely to trigger if I'm dealing with a storm slab. And the avalanche size might be D2 or D3. Okay? Still a big avalanche, still of high consequence. But this, for me, was a great way to overlay what the avalanche forecasters are trying to tell me. Another way you could get to considerable hazard might be something that y'all don't often see, but Paul talked about this morning, is that deep persistent slab, right? Bigger avalanches, lower likelihood of triggering. So you have a great resource here in terms of getting information, and this is the current conditions. They're going to start soon. But you'll have a ton of information. But as a backcountry traveler, I don't know about you, but for me, I still feel like there's uncertainty. The forecasters are giving me their best estimate of the hazard of the risk, but they're not forecasting slope scale. And so how do I, as a backcountry traveler, systematically approach each day? As a backcountry traveler, it's really easy to end up in moderate ski terrain. I apologize for the skier bias. I am a skier. You don't want to see me on a snowboard or a snowmobile. But how do we navigate moderate ski terrain that is really easy to end up with advanced avalanche terrain? So while we may look at it as a 30-degree slope, the consequences may be significant, and it may take more of a skill set to actually evaluate this. So navigating a complex environment is something that really fascinates me. And my lobby for you all today is that we be more like Van Halen. And the reason I say be more like Van Halen is Van Halen, when they toured in the 90s, had a really complicated set. And in that complicated set, they were traveling to smaller venues than most bands had been. And so what they did is they built a checklist for the crews to build out their set. And buried in there, in line 100 and something, they had a requirement that they have a bowl of M&Ms with all the brown M&Ms taken out in their dressing room. And so they could roll into their dressing room, and the group could look at that bowl of M&Ms, and if there were brown M&Ms in that bowl, or if there were no M&Ms, they knew that that systematic approach had not been followed. And they would cancel the show, or they would go through the set step by step. So this rock and roll band has led the way for other people, right? Well, they didn't totally lead the way. This is an airplane built by Boeing. It was a Model 299, and in the 30s they were trying to test it for the troops in the war. And the first test ended in the death of two really talented pilots. And there was conversation of perhaps this plane is too complicated to fly. And so a group of pilots actually got together, and instead of deciding that they needed more training in order to fly this plane, what they did is they built a checklist. And before taxi, takeoff, and landing, there were steps that they went through systematically. And it's not that these pilots were bad pilots. They were very talented pilots, but it's easy to skip a step every once in a while. Doctors took the lead from pilots, and they also built out checklists. And Kevin talked about the Atul Gawande book, The Checklist Manifesto. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And one of the things that Atul Gawande talked about is that basically building a systematic approach, it's not to say that doctors aren't well trained. It's basically that all of us are human, and to err is human, and every once in a while, someone forgets a step. The goal of the checklist is, one, to build a team, because the first part of this checklist is to introduce yourself and create a voice for everyone, and then to have a systematic approach, so you're doing each surgery step by step in the same way. That's not to say each surgery is the same, but it's a systematic approach to a challenging, complicated situation. And I would lobby, and I think our industry is moving more and more towards this, that we as skiers and snowboarders and snowmobilers and just mountainous, snowy mountain users could benefit from a systematic approach as well. And so this is a checklist that we at the American Avalanche Institute have developed. We were fortunate enough to work with one of the guys from Boeing who develops checklists for a living, and he helped us take a really long, big checklist into a really simple format. And the goal with this checklist, first and foremost, on the left-hand side, you'll see that it's pre-trip. So pre-trip plan, this is in your slippers, hanging out, drinking coffee. What do you need to do before you even walk out the door? There's a couple cues in terms of before entering avalanche terrain, and possibly this checklist is out all day or at breaks, but a cue for the conversation that you need to have. And then at the end, a post-trip discussion. There's a lot of learning that we can all take away if we sit down and talk about what happened during the day. So step 1, pre-trip plan. And part of that pre-trip plan is figuring out the current conditions. And the resources that I always use are my Avalanche Forecast Center, and then there's always word of mouth, and there's other forums that give you ideas. But you want to know the recent weather. You want to know if and when there's been any avalanches, where they've been, and then the current avalanche hazard. I want to know what avalanche problem I'm dealing with. And the reason that avalanche professionals have chosen to use these avalanche problem icons and these definitions is that all of us, when we go in the mountains, should treat moderate hazard with a storm slab problem very differently in terms of our terrain choices than moderate hazard with a deep slab problem. These are 2 days when my forecast center in Jackson rated the hazard moderate. And you can see the consequence of getting caught in an avalanche looks really different. So understanding the avalanche problem is important in terms of dictating our terrain choice. And if there's ever a question, and this has been referred to in a lot of the talks, if you're ever confused, if there's ever uncertainty, simpler terrain is your answer, right? But one of the things before I even walk out of that door is I want to define what terrain is open, and this is a vocabulary we've chosen to use. There may be different vocabulary out there, but open terrain means terrain that I would feel confident and comfortable in navigating and skiing, provided I don't see any contrary indications, provided I don't see any obvious instabilities. It's appropriate for the hazard of that day. Closed terrain means no way, we're not touching it, no matter how good the snow is, no matter if we don't see any signs of instability, no matter how solid our stability tests are, we're just not going there. And then standby terrain for me is I need more information. So that's the definitions that we've used. And I borrowed this graphic from Bruce Tremper. This is another way to look at terrain. And again, he's looking at slope angle and then increased consequences. So yet another way to define that. But what's open and what's closed for the day? And I do my homework by looking at maps, by looking at Google Earth, and having a conversation with my partners. And one way I frame terrain, this is my backyard. I do a lot of ski guiding out of bounds at the Jackson Hole Mountain Resort. This is Google Earth from that. This little picture is looking back at the tram, if folks are familiar with that. This is Cody Peak, which we spend a lot of time guiding, provided we have low hazard and good conditions. And then this is just a little zoom in of that. If I have low hazard and possibly a storm slab or no avalanche problem, the sky's the limit for my terrain choices, provided myself and my clients, that's within our abilities. As the hazard increases, when I'm thinking about closed and open terrain, I close more terrain. I take more terrain off the table. This is moderate hazard. Considerable might look something like this. And high hazard might look like this, or it might just be blank and I'm staying inbounds with my clients. So we talk a lot about terrain selection, but putting it visually on a map was really helpful for me. Think about those places that are green light terrain, that are no consequence, and those might be your open terrain, even in high hazard, and then build it out from there. Build a solid team, and part of doing that is actually going through this pre-trip plan with folks. If you can't all sit at the same table before you meet at the roadhead, make sure everyone's on the same page, make sure everyone's prepared, and that you do a transceiver check as well is what's on the checklist. So the conversation piece that happens out in the field, and again, we deal with complex scenarios as backcountry travelers, and there's always these what-if scenarios. What we did with this checklist, and it's continuing to evolve, was take the pieces that would kill us, and most likely kill us, and try and trigger a conversation around those. So measuring the slope angle and talking about the consequences of the terrain, and I think Colin talked about this this morning quite well, of understand what would happen to me if I got caught in an avalanche. And Kevin just touched on that as well. Look at that consequence of the terrain and make sure that this terrain is appropriate with the current avalanche problem. That's another question here. Is this terrain appropriate to travel in with the current avalanche problem? And are we actually seeing the same avalanche problem that we thought we would? because some days surprise us. And if we're not sure or we're seeing a different avalanche problem, if any uncertainty exists, choose simpler terrain. That's definitely the goal. And with avalanche problems, I threw this graph in. Again, this is something from Bruce Tremper. The peak of the storm is our peak instability. So basically on the left side of the graph, it's your instability or your stability. So low instability or very good stability at the bottom, very poor stability at the top, and then time along the lower axis. Your peak of the storm is your peak of your instability. We all know this, right? If we're just dealing with a storm slab avalanche problem, that instability tapers off quite quickly. And we may wait a day, and our avalanche hazard and our conditions change quite quickly. When we have an unusual year, like Paul was talking about this morning, then that time that it takes for those persistent weak layers to strengthen or to not become a problem anymore is much slower. So understanding the avalanche problem also means if I'm going out one weekend and then I'm at work all week and it snows and the forecasters are telling me it's a persistent slab problem, I might need to be conservative on my next weekend. So it takes a lot longer for storms to stabilize on top of a persistent weak layer. Another thing this checklist asks if there's any obvious clues, looking for recent avalanche activity, cracking, collapsing. Let's see if this plays. I don't know how to make it play. There we go. Y'all need any more information? Obvious instability. I don't have to pull out my shovel. I need to adjust my terrain choices if I haven't already. Here's another example of an obvious sign of instability. Can we play this one?
Go.
Yeah. This is a layer of surface ore that we dealt with for quite a while, but really obvious. Sometimes it's not that obvious. And if I'm ever confused, if I get results like this, I have a really easy choice, right? I'm choosing conservative terrain. If I ever get a result where I'm left scratching my head, again, I'm going to ask if the terrain is appropriate. And if I'm confused, I'm going to notch it back. But a question to ask, and that's on this checklist, is the terrain appropriate for the current conditions? And then taking the time to have a conversation, making sure all your partners are on the same page and that no one is concerned, because my rule of any group that I travel with is that if one person is concerned, then we change the plan. We've all got to be on the same page. We've all got to be comfortable. And the other piece of standing at the top of the run and making sure that everyone's on the same page is you can then communicate your plan, right? Where you're going to stop, where the safe zones are, what that communication looks like, what the escape routes are. And then I think one of the most important pieces of this checklist that has been overlooked in our industry for a long time is post-trip. It's important to have a conversation with your partners of if you made good decisions or if you got away with something, because this is the way that we can learn. Snow and avalanches are what we call a wicked learning environment. We do not always get direct feedback. When you go bowling and you do it incorrectly, you throw a gutter ball. You know immediately you did it wrong. In the snow and avalanche world, we don't always know if we made a mistake, but we can learn from debriefing and having a discussion with our partners. So, surgeons take the time to do checklists not because they aren't good at their job, but because sometimes it's easy to skip a step because maybe in that operation it's not relevant. Checklists give us a systematic approach to managing complex situations, and hopefully we as a community can adopt some sort of systematic approach. It gives us the tools to stop and have a conversation more than you go first, like Kevin talked about. And I've had those close calls as well. And for me, having a framework to have a conversation would be a great starting point, and currently is a great starting point. So thank you very much.
Do we have any questions for Sarah? And if someone's really just loath to come up to the mic, you can speak your question, and I'm happy to repeat it.
I'll ask questions I can't get.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. There is. I brought one of them to cheat. I've got a handful of them if folks are interested. But on this checklist, there is actually a during tour. Right now, it's phrased as before entering avalanche terrain. We're editing that right now of during the day. And in terms of addressing uncertainty or what if the conditions aren't what you expected, we don't have a step-by-step list on this checklist just because it's too much to fit, but our emphasis and what is written is if there's any uncertainty or concerns, to choose simpler terrain. And that is written on this checklist. Yeah.
Thank you for that. How about, I see a hand raised here. Is the checklist available online was the question.
It is not currently available online, and we're navigating if and how to do that.
How about you in front? The question was, are there plans to develop further checklists like companion rescue or triage scenario checklists?
We are in the process right now of editing this checklist, and we are developing a couple different checklists. First and foremost, we're addressing a ski area checklist for before running routes and while on routes. And then there are plans to develop a few more checklists, and the order is still, we're negotiating it.
Any more questions? Sarah, thank you so much.
Thank you.